Hey there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing and sometimes science. So today we are returning to guest interviews. It's been a little while. You guys have been listening to me drone on about, this backcountry fly fishing thing that we're here to talk about, I think. And that's been fun, at least for me. I can't speak for you. I hope that you've had a good time, but I've definitely had a good time. And now it's time to talk to some people who are a lot smarter than I am on some of these subjects. As most of you probably know, part of what spring brings and part of what we talked about is runoff. And that's when all the snow up in those great big mountains that we like to look at so much starts to melt and gets dumped into these river systems, resulting in some pretty wild changes in flow and temperature and water clarity and a whole bunch of other things that can really complicate fishing for you, especially for the latter part of spring and the early part of summer. And we're going to talk about that today with a true expert in water science, Brandon Forbes, who oversees basically the entire hydrologic data collection network in Colorado for the U.S. Geological Survey. If you're not familiar with USGS, this is a federal agency. They do a whole bunch of different stuff. I mean, they do like earthquake monitoring. I think they do volcanoes, and they also do, most importantly to us fly anglers, water and rivers and snowmelt and snowpack and flows and all of that stuff. When you're getting ready to go for a trip, we've talked about these here before, and you're looking at, stream flow and water temperature, if it's available, and all of those stats, you're probably looking at data coming from a USGS water monitoring station that they have hiked in or helicoptered in. And we'll talk to Brandon a little bit about that, and stuck on the river for a lot of reasons. One of which is that it's helpful to you as an angler, but also because it's incredibly helpful to know what's going on with our water. I mean, we drink this stuff. Floods can be a problem. There's just a lot. I mean, human life is based around water. And these are the people whose job it is to understand this incredible liquid that we all depend on, both for fishing and for life, at a scientific level. So talking to Brandon about the science of this stuff, in addition to about some of the fishing implications, because he is also a fly fisherman, of course, is absolutely fascinating. So if you're the kind of angler who, like me, really loves to get into the nerdy science stuff of how these ecosystems work and go beyond just catching the fish to understanding why or why not you're catching the fish at a really scientific level, this episode is for you. I think you're going to have a lot of fun. So with that said, let's go ahead and hop in and talk to Brandon Forbes with USGS. So we are here today with Brandon Forbes with the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the most interestingly named federal agency, I think. He's a fellow Coloradan down in Pueblo. Is that right, Brandon?
Yes, sir. I'm down in Pueblo.
Cool. And he showed up in a Sim shirt, so he probably is also a fly fisherman, which will be awesome. But Brandon's with us today to talk about all things water and what USGS does, with a particular focus on runoff. So everybody probably knows that once we start getting into late April or May, that snow really starts coming off in the high country, and then the rivers get really, really crazy, and then fly fishing gets pretty complicated. So Brandon, thanks for hopping on, man. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, Ross, thanks for having me. This is great.
Awesome. Well, maybe we could start a little bit with just you introducing yourself and telling us how you got into the wild world of water management and monitoring.
Yeah, for sure. My name's Brandon Forbes, and I am the Associate Director of the U.S. Geological Survey's Colorado Water Science Center. And in my role at the Science Center, I oversee the state of Colorado's hydrologic data collection networks. The largest of those networks is the network that is near and dear to our hearts, is the Stream Gauge network. But I also have a water quality network, both real-time and discrete water quality sampling network, a groundwater monitoring network, and atmospheric monitoring networks.
So tell me a little bit more about, because that's a lot, right? I mean, USGS does a lot when it comes to water. Why is that? I mean, I know there are different reasons for different types of monitoring and stations, but I think sometimes people don't. I mean, we're simple fly fishermen. We're just looking at flows and water temps if they're on there. But you guys are obviously doing it for other reasons. So tell us a little bit about how all that comes into play and why those networks exist.
Absolutely. First off, the agency it's a really interesting agency, and it was founded in 1879 by an act of Congress to become the science arm for the Department of the Interior. And there's many different divisions within USGS. If you're tuned into the Earthquake Monitoring Network or you subscribe to Shake Alerts, you're very familiar with what's going on there. In fact, we had an earthquake yesterday in Thailand that is hot news today. There's also the Volcano Monitoring Network that many people are familiar with. If you're paying attention to Kilauea, she's been putting on a magical show over the last 2 months. But I am part of the Water Division, and our mission is to provide reliable, impartial, and timely water information that water managers need to better understand the water resources of the United States. And our network started on the Rio Grande River in Embudo, New Mexico in 1889. So we've been doing this for quite a long time. And today, our network consists of over 12,000 stream gauges nationally. 1,000 of those gauges have been collecting data for over 100 years.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody has ever seen these, but if you're ever out hiking around, they're kind of cool. And actually, Brandon, maybe you can correct me. I've always thought that these were the stream gauges based on where they are, but maybe I'm wrong. But they're like little stations. They have solar panels on top of them with an antenna that beam the information out and then some instruments that stick down in the water. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. The solar panels and satellite telemetry that you're seeing, that's absolutely intentional. We have that kind of standalone systems out on the landscape, particularly to be valuable during flood events or power outages or extreme storm events. And so the gauges all operate kind of on their own network. We have our satellites. We use a NOAA satellite called GOES. The data is transmitted out to space and then back to our databases where it can be available for all of you in real time. So what you're seeing is our stuff out there.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, some of those things are in pretty remote areas. I've been surprised to find them off in the middle of these kind of godforsaken canyons. And then I always wonder about the poor people that were forced to plug that stuff in and set them up, man. But they are all over the place. And if you spend any time on the river, you're likely to see these little science stations. And our friend Brandon is responsible for those. You say there are 12,000 of them in the country?
12,000 in the U.S., yeah. And in Colorado alone, we have 375.
Wow. Okay. Wild.
And 31 of our 375 have been collecting data for over 100 years. So like I said, we've been doing this a really long time in some really important places where water information is critical.
So tell me a little bit about how you got involved in it. I mean, USGS has been around for a long time, but it's a fairly niche area, I would imagine. So what's your background and how did you get wrapped up with our federal friends?
Oh, you'll love this. I grew up fly fishing in New England. I lived right on the banks of the Farmington River in Northwest Connecticut. And in high school, I really fell in love with fly fishing, and I would spend 150 days a year on the water. And when I went to college, I moved down to Tucson, Arizona, and I had no idea what I wanted to study. But I figured, hey, what the heck? Let's go into fisheries management. And I really wanted to learn about bugs. And so I started taking entomology classes, introduction to hydrology classes. And I quickly learned that in all the time that I had spent wading rivers, trying to get dead drifts and looking at different velocity patterns in the water, like we all do fly fishing, kind of have this innate understanding of river hydraulics. And that translated into me really easily grasping the mathematical background of hydrology. And at the end of the day, when you solve a hydrologic problem out of a textbook, you have to ask yourself, does that answer make sense? And us as fly fishermen have a really good understanding of what makes sense because we've experienced all these different conditions. And at that point, I gravitated more towards hydrology and hydraulics and focused my studies there. I started with the USGS at the Arizona Water Science Center in Tucson. I was fascinated by flash floods. And I spent 15 years down there working with the center. It was an awesome place to work. Flash flooding is so fascinating, how quickly it can happen and how powerful water can be. And then 4 years ago, I decided to come up to Colorado and focus, hopefully the rest of my career, on snow hydrology, mountain hydrology, and the ecosystems that we have here in Colorado. So like I said, I've been up here 4 years working with the Colorado Water Science Center. It's been fantastic.
That's amazing. And 150 days a year, that's a lot, man. I try to get to 100 every year, and I thought that was a lot. 150 is, that's mental illness, I think, Brandon.
You know it, man. I'm one of these people that when we get into something and want to learn about it, man, I go all in. And I was all in as a kid, fly fishing.
That's awesome. Before we started recording here, we were chatting a little bit about the Arkansas down through Pueblo, and lamenting a little. Well, I was anyway. How busy it's gotten. Brandon was trying to talk me out of it, I think. But are you still hitting? I'm sure you're not doing 150 days a year anymore, but it sounds like you're still out there quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I like to get out as much as I can. I like the 11-mile area, the South Platte, love fishing the Arkansas, spend some time in the southwest corner of the state on the Animas and the San Miguel. But I'm one of these Colorado folks that have too many outdoor hobbies, so I snowboard a lot in the wintertime. So I haven't been fishing much right now. I'm trying to get in as many days on the snowboard as I can.
Yeah, see, I resist those other hobbies for exactly that reason. It's like I've got room for a couple. I can work out and I can fish, and then if I try to add anything else, it messes me up. So I feel you on that one. Um, just out of curiosity, so when you're, obviously you do this for a living, it sounds like it's basically what you've done your entire career, which is amazing. And then you're also still going out and fishing. And I'm curious to know how it alters your sort of mindset when you're out there fishing or the way that you look at the river, because it's got to change it, I would imagine, having a background in the science the way that you do.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things is, and this goes for all my staff. So if any of y'all are out there and you see one of my 75 staff members out in the water making measurements, a huge part of science is just observing your study. And I've spent so much time in the water, both fishing and professionally, that you just look at things a lot differently. And some of the things that I'm really interested in as a scientist is trying to figure out how to really accurately measure high flow and what technology we can use to do that, and how to better feed hydraulic models and modeling software to improve those estimates. And spending so much time in the water and spending so much time at work trying to measure it in different ways, it creates a very different perspective. I find that I can read water, and I can locate fish easily because, like I said, we're around it every day. And so it's really fun to be there professionally where you're working and testing different sensors, and then can go out on the weekend and have some fun with your fly rod.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to ask you a personal question here, and it's either going to make me feel better about myself or much worse about myself. But every now and then I will hike in, especially to a tailwater where you have those sort of real variable flows. I mean, it can happen on the freestones too for various reasons, but it feels like you can get those real big flow bumps on the tailwaters. And sometimes I have amazing days, and man, sometimes I struggle bus out there. And sometimes when I struggle bus, I convince myself that it's because there was a flow bump a day before or 2 days before. And that kind of bombs my my wounded ego a little bit. But I've never known for sure if that's true or scientific. I'm curious for your thoughts on that before we go deeper here.
I feel the same way, man. Whether it's a drastic change in barometric pressure, or a flow change or release out of a reservoir where fish are kind of moving around and looking for where they want to be, not necessarily where they want to, like, where are they currently eating at the time. Yeah, these changes, I feel the same way, affect my productivity on the fly rod for sure.
I'm so glad to hear you say. I've had almost fist fights about barometric pressure with people that say it doesn't matter. But I swear, when those cold fronts come through, it's like a light switch. And now you guys have heard it from a scientist that that's a real thing. So I just wanted to say I was right. That's all.
Yeah, I think you're right. Changes affect the fish. They just do. And fish move around and need to get resettled. I think that's a legit observation, Ross.
Thanks, man. See, I'm kind of a scientist somewhere underneath the caveman exterior, I think, but that's cool. So tell me a little bit about the stations themselves. We talked a little bit about it earlier. So I kind of mentioned, a lot of these things they're way out there. If you guys ever go on to, and Brandon, I hope we could talk a little bit about where folks can go to get the information in a little while. But if you ever go on to the map that USGS has of these 375 stations scattered around the state, some of them are where you would expect, kind of right off of a highway, where I assume that maintenance and setup and everything else is fairly easy. But a lot of them are not. They're tucked away into these places that are really important above reservoirs or in canyons. But very often pretty far from a road or a trail. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just the technology that's in those stations, and then how they get set up. Are you like helicoptering people in there? Are they hiking in with all the gear and setting them up, or how does it work?
Yeah, I first want to talk about the amazing team we have here that are actually maintaining these sites. I do not get to go out in the field as much as I used to in my current role. So yeah, like I said, I have a team of 75 people that have dedicated literally their lives to maintaining these stations and spend their entire career making sure these stations are accurate. But yes, I mean, we have people snowmobiling in, they're skinning in on skis or split boards. They're hiking long distances. We have some trips where people are camping at the site because they can't hike in and hike out on the same day. When we have emergency response deployments for flood warning after wildfires, absolutely, we're helicoptering in equipment, helicoptering in staff to be able to install those gauges as quickly as possible. It's a very, very technical job. And it's a very dangerous job, honestly. All of us fly fishers, we have a very large respect for the power of water, and my staff is out essentially on some days putting themselves at risk, going on, above, or in the water to get these measurements and calibrate these gauges. A lot of times in the backcountry, I have so much respect for what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine it's hard enough to hike camping gear in there. And once you're trying to hike in scientific gear and do all that work and camp and probably fish a little bit, I bet you guys take fly rods in there sometimes. It probably gets pretty complicated pretty quickly.
You know, it's hard, and I always volunteer to do it. Uh, we have to hike car batteries in and out of gauges because we need a battery supply or a power supply overnight when we're not getting solar energy. And yeah, we're hiking in batteries all the time, so we have very heavy packs in the backcountry.
Yeah, how big are the teams? Is it one or two people or is it three? Or how do you, I guess it depends probably on where they're going, right? What they need to carry.
Yeah, it totally depends on the site location and the conditions. As we're moving towards high flow with what we're here talking about today, we usually do not go out alone. It's so much safer to go out in at least 2 or 3 people teams. So we target sending folks out in groups, and it's really a safety thing. And it can be a really technical experience trying to take a discharge measurement of a river at a high flow. And so having more hands and more eyes on the water is critical to keeping people safe.
Can you walk us through kind of the major, and I know there's a ton of data that come back from these stations because I spend a bunch of time geeking out on it on a pretty regular basis, but maybe you could walk us through the sort of top line data points that we get back from these. And then I know some of the stations will report, maybe it is CFS and flow and also gauge height. And then some of them also have temperature readings, but others don't. And I guess I'm curious about how you decide which station has which measuring tools, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then what all are they collecting while they're out there doing their thing in the backcountry?
Yeah, no doubt. Let's start with how we decide what parameters to collect at each location. So the station placement and the parameters is very multifaceted. Our primary objective is to provide flood warning during emergencies. So we will place gauges at above confluences or on major waterways, above urban areas, above where people live, so that we do have the timing to provide the data to get flood warning out to folks. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of other components: inventorying our water for reservoir operations, measuring up and downstream of reservoir for dam operations, up above and below intakes for municipal and agricultural water systems. But the really cool thing about our network is that it's very much local customer based. So the 375 sites that we have in Colorado, if you can believe it, we have over 100 local, state, and federal partners that support those gauges. So the next time you're at a water conservancy district meeting or a county board meeting or your utility meeting, essentially thank the folks that are our neighbors funding this network. If without their support, this network would be very, very different. And since we have local interests, those local folks have a say in what parameters they'd like to collect at each gauge. And so the new parameters that we're exploring include our surface velocity sensors, which are new to the USGS, specific conductance sensors to monitor how much salinity is in the water, real-time pH sensors, nitrate sensors. And then what's really important to our fishing community is our water temperature sensors, our dissolved oxygen sensors, and our turbidity sensors. And turbidity is how cloudy the water is. Those 3 parameters are super important in addition to discharge when we go fishing, and can be great tools to use before you go out into the wild.
Yeah, especially in the spring. I actually was out yesterday in a fairly remote section of canyon that I'm sure you're familiar with because there is a gauge down in there. But I'm not going to name it here for the sake of hopefully not spot burning it too bad. But it's always a risk in the spring because if there's not a temperature gauge on those stations, you can hike in. And yesterday it was great. I got down there and the water was 43 and it was beautiful. It was perfect. Sometimes I get down there and I stick my trusty meat thermometer in the water and it's 34 and it's like, oh, shit, I hiked in here and probably not going to have a great day. So I always really appreciate when the temperature gauges are on those things. So for whatever it's worth, if we can make those standard on all 375, I'm all about it, man.
Yeah, I would love that. Temperature is a really important parameter, not just for fisheries, but especially in urban areas downstream of water users like power generation or outflows from water treatment facilities. It's really important to understand stream temperature. Can also be a really good indicator that tributaries upstream are contributing. So if a stream temperature can be relatively cool and then all of a sudden spikes and gets like a step warmer, we know there's an input coming in from a rainstorm. So like this information is super, super important to understand the hydrology, especially in the mountains.
So you touched on this a little bit already, and I promise we are eventually going to talk about runoff, but I find all this super fascinating. You have all of these, you call them customers, so folks that have other interests in the data beyond what you're collecting it for, at least it's at a top line. So once I got to imagine that includes like water managers and folks that are dealing with drinking water. Like you already mentioned power generation and all of that stuff, fishermen, obviously rafting companies, all of that stuff. How do you push it out there? How do folks get to this? I mean, I know you share some of it probably through those direct lines of communication, but then I would imagine that you have a lot of other folks that maybe aren't in direct communication with you who also want to find it. So where would folks, just as a baseline, start to go and find this stuff and dig in if they were so inclined?
Water data for the nation. If you Google USGS water data for the nation, that will give you every single hydrologic piece of information that we've collected since the late 1800s. But if you really just want current information, the National Water Dashboard, the USGS National Water Dashboard, is an incredible tool, and it's a map-based tool. You can zoom into your current location on your phone. You can see all the USGS data being collected in your zone, and then you can click on each individual data point to get real-time conditions at that site.
And do they interface at all with, I mean, I'm sure in every state it's a different name, but here in Colorado, we have the Division of Water Resources and they have their own stations that are scattered all over the place too. But I think I've noticed that sometimes they either share stations with you all or they're sort of co-located. So is there a partnership there as well?
Yeah, the state of Colorado, they do have a stream gauge network, and they do have a web interface, and they ingest all of our data and then we'll overlay it with their data. So they're a repository of this information as well. We do work very closely with the state. We have obviously common interests, and there's multiple different stream gauges that we operate in partnerships. Sometimes we'll co-locate our water quality equipment at one of their discharge measuring sites. So we can leverage their discharge data and work together on water quality parameters. So yeah, it's very much a collaborative relationship.
Yeah, they're a great tool as well. I kind of look at both, I feel. And there are some places where you have gauges and they don't, and other places where they have gauges and maybe you don't. But they tend to be pretty well synced, which is super helpful when you're looking to get out there. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about flow patterns in the spring. So, we're recording this in late March. We're going to get, I always kind of call it the golden month of April, where the water temperatures come up, the freestones reopen, you get some really good fishing at reasonable flows, and then everything blows up. So maybe talk to me a little bit about the curve of sort of that flow increase over the course of the spring as things start warming up.
Yeah, we're certainly, gosh, with how warm it's been over the last couple of weeks, we're certainly getting into our high flow time. So our high flows are really dictated by how much snow is in our mountains and then how fast we warm. We do have 14 snow monitoring stations at high elevation scattered across the state of Colorado. So a good thing to look at right now would be those snow stations, see how much snowpack is up there, see how fast it's decreasing. And then you can start to look at the stream gauges higher in the watershed to see how the snow is starting to run off and impact our rivers. But yeah, we have really two patterns of runoff that we have to be aware of when we're going out and fishing. You have this large seasonal rise, that's our snowpack melting over time. And then you have a diurnal cycle, which is driven by the daily heating and cooling from the sun and then at night. And so, like I said, you'll have this long-term rise that tends to peak late May, early June, and then this diurnal pattern that you most of the time in a 24-hour period, your low flows are going to be in the morning once the watersheds have frozen overnight, and then your higher flows for that cycle are going to be in the evening once that snow has melted and started to run off. And of course, the timings vary how high you are in elevation. But rule of thumb is, in the mornings, you're going to have a little bit lower flows than you will have in the afternoon from the sun. And in general, in Colorado, flows will increase until about late May or early June before they start coming back down.
Yeah, and that tracks with, the stations that do have the temperature monitors on them. You can kind of see that diurnal pattern in there as well, with the big peaks during the day as the water warms up and then dipping back down. And for what it's worth, sometimes I find that the water temperature will change in kind of crazy, erratic ways over the course of the day too, depending on how high up in the watershed you are. You would think that it would always get warmer, but every now and then I find myself in a place where there's so much snow melt dumping into the system that it actually freezes it. And it's kind of a crazy thing to be standing in water that's like 37 degrees when it's 85 degrees outside and you can't catch a fish, which is always a bummer, but it happens every now and then. So tell me a little bit about, sort of the snow monitoring side of this. Is it related? We've talked a little bit on here before about SNOTEL and being able to look at the SNOTEL sensors and sort of try to interpret that. Some of them, to be honest with you, are a little hard for the layman, I think, to look at and interpret in a way that extrapolates the data out into something that looks like actionable information for a fly fisher. Are your sensors the same as the SNOTEL sensors? Is it a separate network, or how do folks go about finding those things and then interpreting the data as far as what it means for them in runoff season?
Yes, we do have our own snow sensors. It was intentionally built to enhance the SNOTEL network. The SNOTEL network, it tends to be in lower elevation below tree line. And we have a long, persistent snowpack that tends to really drive runoff events into June at a higher elevation above 11,000 feet. So our 14 stations are targeting high elevation locations. What's interesting about measuring snow is it's really, really difficult to understand. It varies widely, and it's spatially distributed very inconsistently, redistributed by wind, and it evolves throughout the snow season. And so these stations are super complex and they collect a ton of parameters. But what we're really trying to get at is how much snow water equivalent, or SWE, is in the snowpack at that location. And a couple other things that we're interested in trying to figure out is the effects of dust on snow. And so as dust accumulates on the snow surface, especially as the snowpack melts, it gets darker in color, which absorbs more sun energy, which drives the snowpack to melt faster. And it's critical to understand that when water managers are trying to move around water, fill reservoirs, make deliveries to canals, start the irrigation season. And so we have up-looking and down-looking radiation sensors that are targeting those parameters. We're also trying to figure out how to understand this process called snow sublimation. It's the process when it's very dry and windy. Snow will transition from the ice phase, skip the liquid phase, and go directly to gas phase. We'll essentially lose that snow to evaporation, and it does not become water. And understanding how that happens and how that evolves through the spring season is really important to water managers to know how much water they can expect to run off of the watersheds. So yes, when you visit these snow stations online and Google them and start looking at these parameters, it's super complex. And we're trying to create these stations to better understand these really difficult things to measure. And as far as the snow data collection goes, we have a big field effort scheduled next week. I'm actually going to go out on it. We do these just amazing data collection campaigns. So snow stations are really good at measuring the conditions at that point. But the snow can vary so much, in a mile in each direction. It can be so different. So every year, usually happens about March, we go out with a huge team and we do a ton of different data collection in a big zone around the snow station. We'll have a team digging snow pits from the surface of the snow to the earth, and we'll measure temperature and density of snow all the way through the snowpack. We have teams running around with probes with GPS sensors, and they'll take thousands of depth measurements around the snow station so we can try to relate how the snow station's depth references all the different distribution of depth around the snow station in that basin. And then we're experimenting with two different ground penetrating radar systems. We'll have a ground penetrating radar on a sled in which we'll drag around in a transect. And we're trying to use the radar grams to measure the snow water equivalent in a snowfield and also identify facets for avalanche risk. And at the same time, while this is going on, we have a ground penetrating radar system from a drone flying above us. And that's even surveying a larger area that we can't access on foot. And again, just opening up that spatial footprint around the snow station. And this work's been going on for 6 years now. And we're starting to get a much better understanding of how spatially distributed snow qualities can be using a point station like our snow stations and then extrapolating that out to a snow field. So yeah, really, really cool work that we're doing next week to better understand our snow resources.
Yeah, that sounds like a big operation. You got people, and I would imagine kind of a dangerous one in the spring, right? We had a big conversation in the winter season about avalanche risk, which obviously increases in the spring when stuff starts melting and those slabs start getting kind of unstable. But you've got folks running around up there with probes at these high elevation sites above tree line, like you said. I mean, that's kind of extreme work, I would imagine.
Sure is. The training that goes into being able to go do this kind of work is extensive. We also partner with the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, which is one of the resources that I wanted to mention here today to your listeners. It's a great resource for avalanche danger and where you're going to go fishing, and it's a great place to go look and just read a little bit and see what you're getting yourself into if you're headed into the backcountry. So those folks will be out with us in the field too. But yes, our folks are fully avalanche trained, backcountry first aid trained. We take avalanche refresher courses every year. We're using beacons, probes, and shovels constantly. It's just part of what we do.
Yeah, that's an incredible operation. And just as a reminder for everybody listening, you really do want to be looking at those avalanche forecasts every time you go out, especially early season high alpine lakes. There are a lot of those that are in cirques and basins that are prime avalanche territory. And just because it's June and you're wearing shorts and flip-flops in Denver, does not mean that you're not potentially putting yourself in a risky position further up in the mountains. That's a good flag, definitely.
And here's where I wanted to go, Ross, with how do we use all this information that we're collecting. The Colorado River Basin Forecast Center is where you should go to get this information. So they're a branch of NOAA, of the Weather Service. They ingest all of our stream gauge data, all of the snow data, and then all of their weather modeling on their side. And they put together a forecast of what flows will be at all of the stream gauges in the West. In this case, the Colorado River Basin, but each large basin in the West has a forecast office. If you go to those web pages, you know that all the snow data, all the weather data, and all the stream flow data is being used in conjunction to make a flow forecast at a site. And these are especially useful in sites that don't have reservoirs above them where these conditions are naturally occurring. And their forecasts are fantastic to use as a tool.
I did not know that existed, to be honest with you. So, and that's ingesting all the data, both from the lower elevation SNOTEL sites and from your sites and everything else, and then producing how far out does the forecast go? Is it weeks? Is it months?
It's a great question. The accuracy gets much, much less the further out you go, but 3 to 5 days out, you have a very good forecast of what you should expect.
That's awesome to know. Can you say it one more time just so we make sure we've got it?
Yeah, sure. It's a branch of NOAA, but it's the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center.
Okay, well, I've got some new stuff to geek out on. I did not know that was a thing, so I learned something. I appreciate it. All right, so we talked a little bit about the fact that it varies year to year. I'm sure it varies state to state, but if you had to put a little bit of a timeline on, I'm an angler, I want to go out, I want to do some backcountry fly fishing or just regular fly fishing, wherever that might happen to be. If I'm planning a trip, right? How do I plan a trip so that I don't show up, or at least have a reasonably high probability of not showing up and finding this river just blown out at 1,000 CFS, ripping rocks off the bank?
Yeah, gosh, man, it's really hard. It's so variable, and it's so variable year to year, and it's so variable basin to basin. For example, right now in Colorado, in the southwest part of the state, in the Animas and the San Juan, they're pretty low on snow compared to average. So their runoff is going to be less and shorter. So that part of the state may be a place to target earlier in the year. Whereas the northern part of Colorado is more about average for snowpack. So stuff up near Steamboat, for example, they got quite a bit more snow than the San Juans do. The peak there is going to be later in the year and last longer. So yeah, it's really variable basin to basin, year to year, how to target this. Good tools to use, honestly, are the stream gauge networks, the forecasts we just talked about. And another great tool that I haven't mentioned yet is our real-time stream cameras. So we have cameras out on the landscape now that you can access in real time. They collect an image every 15 minutes. And you can click on those sites and see the real-time river conditions. You can get a feel for how turbid the water is. After the runoff, you can see how turbulent it is, how much white water you're looking at. And then you can even see the banks and see how difficult it's going to be for you to hike in and access the river along the bank, see how much snow is on the bank. So the cameras are a great tool to use now. And this is a new product for us. It's been over the last couple of years. Right now we have 12 of these cameras installed. We're hoping to have 20 by the end of the year. And yeah, they're just great tools. I look at them every morning when I get to the office.
I have used those a couple of times on, I think Clear Creek has one, and there are a few others around there too that I always kind of look at. I tend to find, and that's a really good flag from Brandon, that every basin is different. I tend to have a few sort of test streams that I think are somewhat indicative of what I'm going to find in the backcountry that are more closely monitored. So you can always find a couple, sort of make an educated guess with the understanding that you might still show up and find it being a raging torrent of death. But at least you can make an almost guess about it. But the cameras are awesome. Is there a plan you said you're going to go to 20. Is there a plan to keep expanding the number from there?
Yeah, 100%. I'd love to see almost every one of our stations have a camera one day. I don't think we're too many years away from that. The cost of the camera equipment and then the telemetry to get the imagery back to the office and onto the web is getting lower and lower. So yeah, we're just going to keep expanding that network as fast as we can.
Awesome. That's really good to hear.
And to put into perspective of what we're talking about here from kind of our base flow conditions, which happened, kind of early March, late February, when things are really cold in the mountains, to this late May, early June period. I pulled some data from the Roaring Fork in Glenwood Springs last year, and at low flow, it's about 425 CFS. At high flow, it peaked last year on June 9th, to put that into perspective, and it was 7,300 CFS. So we're talking major differences in flow here from just a couple of months apart. And so when that snow comes off, it's coming off fast. And I pulled some depth data. The depth increased from that low flow to that high flow depth over 6 feet. So we're talking a lot of water moving through these rivers, and Roaring Fork is a fantastic river to fish in the summertime. If folks aren't aware, it's the valley that drains the Aspen area. So just a gorgeous, gorgeous fishery. But yeah, major water moving through there late May, early June.
Yeah, 400 to 7,000 is a wild swing. I mean, I've seen, maybe 200 or 300 up to 2,000, but 400 to 7,000 is crazy. Wow. All right. So let's say that you do this wrong and you try to predict everything and you show up and the river is running at, well, hopefully not 7,000. That's that's a lot of water. But let's say it's running at 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 when it would usually be at, 200, 300, 500, somewhere in that range. You both as a scientist who obviously cares a lot about safety around the water, I would imagine, but also as a fly fisherman, what do you recommend as far as safety? If I show up and that's what I find, what do I do?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, you have to be careful around the water. You have to have a plan. And we tell all our folks this because our staff, they're in the water every day. You have to have a plan for when you go for a swim, no matter what the condition. And you have to have a plan of how you're going to egress from your waders, or how you're going to get to the shore, how you're going to go over strainers and not go under strainers. We wear life jackets every time we're near water, like whether it's an inch deep or 100 feet deep. We're wearing life jackets because water is a super dangerous thing. Life jackets are not a terrible thing to consider to wear if you're out in heavy conditions. And the life jackets today that inflate once they're submerged, they're pretty low profile and super safe. That's something that, folks might need to consider. But like we spoke about earlier, going out in groups so you're not alone out there. One great thing to have with you is a GPS tracker. They're pretty inexpensive these days. And somebody knows where you are, and you have an SOS button to hit if something bad were to happen to you and you were to get stuck. It's a great tool to have in the backcountry. And then just to plan what to do when you get wet, because everybody's going to get wet one day. Extra socks, wool socks, extra clothing. What are you going to do if you start shivering? Those kind of things are just important to think about before you go out into the backcountry.
Yeah, and I would say, so every year I drive by some of the streams that are closer to town, and they're just, raging, right? Like the whole stream is whitewater. And I will still see people in waders attempting to get out into the water. And I might even go a little further and say that, if it looks like it could kill you, it probably could. And it might be a good idea for you not to go in the water. If you want to stand on the banks, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, but maybe you can throw some streamers along the banks or something. But, man, at a certain point, it's just go somewhere else, But yeah, if you do have to be out there, life jackets are good. We've talked a lot about backcountry safety. If you get wet, having a fire starter, having an emergency blanket, having dry clothes, being aware of the fact that you might be hours away from somebody helping you. Or if you fall in, water moves pretty quick. You can find yourself pretty far downriver pretty fast, and that can turn into a real bad situation if you're not careful. So I would advise not messing with it wherever possible. But if you are going to, then yeah, go all out, life jackets and everything else, because you can never really be too safe if it's roaring like that.
Yeah, and just one thing that we've all experienced is you'll wade out into the stream. You're fishing. You find a great spot to drift some flies, and the water's hitting you kind of right in the side of your body. And man, that first step when you decide to turn around, go back, or move, and that water pushes against either your stomach or back, we've all felt that. That's a really dangerous situation that you have to be prepared for. And in places where there's heavy velocity, it's scary. And one thing we're starting to deploy, I mentioned it a minute ago, we're starting to deploy velocity sensors. So another data parameter being collected at our gauges is surface velocity. And so before you go out, you can check and see how fast the water's moving. Is it 1 foot per second or 5? That's a huge difference. And so you can start kind of calibrating your brain to the conditions you're comfortable in based on the real-time data, and you can make decisions on where to go.
Yeah, and then once you're out there, be smart about how you're wading, right? There's an old adage in wrestling and all grappling that if somebody can get a hold of your hips, they can throw you over or knock you over. It's the same with water, right? And so if you're wading in fast water, especially in those conditions, don't go in over your hips, because as soon as you unblade your body, like Brandon said, and you turn to face the water either upstream, which is bad, or you turn your back to it, which is way worse. Don't ever do that if you can avoid it. If it's up over your hips, you could very well go for a ride. So it might be best not to put yourself out there if you can avoid it.
Yeah. Be careful. Be careful. And we all know how slippery the rocks can be with algae and stuff. It can get dicey quick.
Yeah, I usually, by the end of the day yesterday, man, and the flows were really low and very manageable. So it's not like I was wading deep, but you're tired. You've been wearing a backpack all day. You've got stuff on you, and you start looking like you're drunk pretty quick. You're slipping on rocks and sliding this way and that way, and it's not hard to lose your footing. And that's especially true if you have the current pushing on you. And at the very least, that could mean you get wet and cold, and that sucks. You have a bad day. Or at the worst, if you're in the middle of nowhere, that could be real bad news. I feel like every year we hear about at least a few people who messed with water they probably shouldn't have and didn't come home, which is sad.
And at the very least, gosh, make sure somebody knows where you're going and when you're expected home, so that if you don't make it to the car, they know where to send folks.
Yeah, and bring the tracker. I'm always preaching about the Garmin InReach. I hate to try to put it out there, but I love that thing, and I always have it with me, partially for the SOS feature, and partially because if I ever do fall in and get washed off into some godforsaken canyon or wherever, at least they'll know where to find me. And if somebody's watching it, they'll know, well, man, the blue dot was up here and now it's 7 miles downstream. Something must have happened. I should probably send help. So bring that with you, and don't forget to turn it on, because if you have time to push the SOS button, awesome. But even if you don't, it means that somebody somewhere knows where you are, and that means that you might be able to get help.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so talk to me a little bit. If you show up to sort of a main stem river and it's in runoff, and maybe it's not peak runoff, where I'm kind of an advocate that if you show up and it's like if it's at 7,000 CFS, you have better things to do with your day, right? There are other things that you can do that are not fly fishing. But if you catch it sort of early on, and you're trying to push through that kind of May time frame until it's really, really raging, or maybe it's on the back half where it's on the way down, but it's still pretty heavy, and you'd still like to catch some fish. Brandon, I mean, you're looking at the flows, but you're also fishing quite a bit. How would you fish something like that? Assuming you can do it safely. So assuming that we've cleared that hurdle, how would you start fishing during those sort of shoulder edges of runoff?
Yeah, well, first off, finding a safe spot to be, and then usually I'm swinging streamers at that point, and so I'll try to be upstream from a pool, get something out, get it down into the pool, and then swim it back up to my safe location. That's kind of my go-to, and I'll just migrate around in different streamer drifts in those conditions and see what I can do. That said, I'm not the greatest streamer fisherman. I have very little success doing that. I wish I could talk to somebody who actually was successful doing that.
I don't think they exist. I don't think there's such a thing as a good streamer fisherman in a stream. I'm the same way. It's like I'll do it. Or, I mean, running a woolly bugger along the banks where the fish are kind of hanging out because they're getting beat up by the flows too, right? They're not hanging out in the middle of the current. They're kind of sticking in the softer water on the banks where they can find it. And I've caught fish on streamers, but it's unreliable, right? Streamers are mostly a still water thing for me. But if you really got to go, you plan a trip and you're going out, and by God, you're going to fish, then yeah, you're going to be chucking streamers at the bank all day, and hopefully it works for you. But I'm with Brandon. I don't always have the best. I don't have the best luck with it, to be honest.
And Ross, what you said is spot on, man. The fish are not out in the 10 feet per second current. They're finding shelter on the banks. So, if the water's even turbid at the same time, which is pretty typical, gosh, those fish could be in less than a foot of water along the banks. And, it's really easy and safe to kind of concentrate your fishing efforts along the banks, and it could be super productive.
Yeah, and it's also a good time if you can get away with fishing anything that isn't a streamer, bright bead heads, bright colors, anything that'll show up a little bit better in that turbid water can help, I think. I mean, we're not talking exact science here, but I tend to do better on something that's got a little bit of flash on it during those periods of turbidity. So talk to me a little bit about the tributaries, Brandon. So we've got the main stems, which obviously are sort of bringing in all of the water from all of the places. But I know that, at least in my experience, I found that, I may not be able to fish the Arkansas, right, or the South Platte because it's just too blown up, or the Colorado. But I can get up into some of the tributaries, and especially if I'm willing, you got to deal with snow and access and all that stuff. But if I can make it closer to the headwaters, if I can make it further up, I tend to have better days because it seems to me that runoff kind of tapers off more quickly in those regions. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, sort of geographically, how runoff plays out over the course of the spring.
Yeah, one thing you can do is kind of start thinking about where you're targeting fishing based on watershed area. There's a tool called StreamStats that you can go online and you can click on any place in the United States and get statistics on the watershed. And you can start looking at watershed size above the different areas you'd like to access. And the smaller the watershed in general, the less effects of these runoff situations are going to have on that particular location. So especially later in the year, when the big rivers are at their peak, yeah, the tributaries probably are slowing down a little bit. And if you can get to a place with a smaller drainage area and a place you like to be, you may be more successful there. The water may be clear, and it may be a little bit lower flow, a little better to manage.
The trade-off there is the temperatures are usually a lot lower, so you're going to have sort of a separate set of challenges. But yeah, I mean, late spring when runoff is starting to taper off, but those main rivers are still not quite ready, getting up in the tributaries and doing some hiking or snowshoeing, depending on how high you are. I tend to have pretty good success with that, and it helps me not lose my mind fishing still water at lower elevations while I wait for the streams to chill out a little bit.
Yeah, no doubt. And then, the tailwaters are always there too. I understand there's just going to be a lot more people there, and maybe it's not quite as desirable for folks, but the tailwaters tend to produce great fishing conditions throughout the year.
Yeah, tell me about the tailwaters a little bit, because so obviously they're not as affected by runoff because you have people intervening, right? I mean, you have somebody managing a dam somewhere on those tailwaters. But that said, they are still affected by runoff because there's only so much water that the reservoirs can hold. So if you are more of a tailwater guy or girl and that's your thing, I prefer the freestones. I'm a creek guy, so I'm all about that. But if your thing is, hey man, I just fish tailwaters and I'm going to go hike into Cheeseman or wherever you're going to be, is there a way to somewhat accurately predict sort of what the timing and the flow levels look like in those areas? Because it is different, I think, than in the other streams.
Yeah, it's definitely different, and it can be tricky. There's a lot of water being moved around the west this time of year because higher elevation reservoirs are filling, lower elevation reservoirs are being filled, so they have to spill that water downstream. Irrigation season's beginning, and so there's a lot of water movement downhill to get water to ag operations. And recreation, there's a lot of flows that are managed so that whitewater zones can be predictable and have high flows for a prolonged period of time. I know the Arkansas is this way. They try to make the rafting season as long as they can based on how much water is in the mountains and in the reservoirs. Honestly, I would say the best way to start thinking about this is pull up that gauge below the dam that you're planning to fish and look at the last 30 days of activity at that site. And then you can see a lot of times you'll see step changes in flow. It'll go from 500 CFS to 900. It'll stay at 900 for 2 days, come back down to 500. And you can start to predict what that looks like. And then if you're even more of an advanced user, you could start going back and looking at years past. You can look at 2024, 2023 during this, not 3-month period of runoff. And you can see the different patterns on how they operated the reservoir that year. A lot of times the patterns are typically the same, right, or close to the same. And so, yeah, that's what I would do. I would look at the last either couple of days of data, a couple of years of data, depending on how deep of a dive you want to go. Just see what's going on at that reservoir and just know that, yeah, you could get there that day and it could be bumped up to 900 when you were expecting 400 because they're moving water. And it doesn't really have much to do with the weather or how much snow is melting. It's just how much water they have to move.
And in some ways, that's a little bit better because they don't get quite as crazy. But in other ways, if you ever go into, especially what I would consider sort of, air quotes, backcountry tailwaters, where you can get right up against the dam, they'll have like rapidly rising water warning signs all over the banks and drowning signs because those flow bumps can happen pretty quickly. And I've actually been in tailwaters before where they've dumped an additional 400 or 500 CFS in over the course of, I don't know, a couple hours, I would guess. And if you're hanging close to the dam and you're standing out in the water, you can get yourself in pretty big trouble pretty quickly. I think maybe a couple guys died on the Arkansas tailwater either last summer or the summer before. I think they were messing around in like 2,000 CFS underneath the dam there, and they just shouldn't have been in the water. But, just because you're not going to see the same 7,000 CFS crazy bumps in the tailwaters, you could still see some pretty significant increases. So I would imagine a lot of the safety stuff still applies.
Yeah, 100%. And look for your warning signs. Look for changes in turbidity. Look for foam on the water when foam wasn't present prior. That's a huge indication that flows are changing and coming down. Another thing we haven't talked about are ice dam failures and ice jam failures. That's a huge risk, man. We've all seen the videos on YouTube of the Roaring Fork and the San Miguel where it'll go from a nice, calm little stream to a raging torrent of icebergs and flood. So yeah, pay attention to your warning signs. And if you watch those ice jam release videos, you can see that the turbidity and the foam kind of changes in the water prior to all that material and flow getting to your location. So pay attention to your surroundings. You can usually have a little bit of indication if the flow is going to change.
That's a good tip about the foam. I guess I hadn't thought about that before. I know turbidity obviously increases when you're potentially looking at a huge surge. We have talked a little bit about ice dams on here because I've had some questionable experiences with those in the past. They're pretty scary. But tell me more about the foam aspect. I don't know that I've heard that or thought much about that before.
Yeah, that's one that they taught us a lot in Arizona because that's obviously some of the most dangerous flash floods in America. When you're wading in a river and you start seeing foam where you hadn't prior, that means there's high water coming. It usually means it's a flood from an ephemeral event. So there was a heavy rainstorm uphill from you, and it's concentrating down into your location. But in the flash floods that I've seen in Arizona where I'm out measuring and then have to egress and then watch this flash flood come through, I saw foam, probably had 3 minutes until the flow arrived, and the flow was probably 4 or 5 feet deeper than the flow that I was measuring prior to the foam. So yeah, the foam is a real thing. Probably not going to be as useful as a tip right below the dam because it won't have much time to do this. But if you're downstream and you start seeing foam, whether it's from a rainstorm, an ice jam failure, or a dam release, you see foam when you didn't prior, that's definitely a warning sign to pay attention and maybe get to a safe location.
This might be a dumb question, but scientifically, why is that? I mean, I know why turbidity would increase, obviously, as the water starts pushing those particles off the bank into the river, or off, I guess, lifting up sediment from the bottom. What causes the foam to form?
Well, it's either a naturally occurring thing from like calcium in the soils that the water's then accessing, mixing, and creating foam. In a city environment, it's runoff from parking lots, runoff from culverts and sewers. So it can be a different source.
That's really interesting. I appreciate that tip. And now I'm going to be, usually I look at the foam as a good place to fish. And now I'm going to be thinking a little bit more carefully about it, I think, if I didn't see it there before. That's really interesting. Okay, well, Brandon, this has been incredibly interesting. Thanks for hopping on with us. If somebody wanted to learn more about USGS, or if there are opportunities for them to get involved or to support the work you're doing, where would they go? What would they do? How does that work?
Yeah, check us out at our Instagram page, USGS Colorado. It's a great place to see all the different USGS science that's happening in Colorado. Usually every state in the nation has their own page, so if you're outside Colorado, check that out. But also there's national social media pages that you can access. And then USGS.gov will provide you access to all the amazing data sets that the USGS has collected over the last 150 years, 140 years. So it's all out there and accessible. And that's one thing that is so amazing about the USGS is every single piece of information that we collect is out there and publicly available. It's all for you.
Awesome. And aside from paying our taxes, since runoff coincides with tax season, unfortunately for all of us, is there anything that folks can do to support your work? Are there ever volunteer opportunities or anything else that would be helpful to you?
Yeah, we have student intern possibilities over the summer when we're doing big projects. There's many ways to participate. We have volunteer programs so people can come and do some days with us in the field as a volunteer. So yeah, just reach out to your local USGS office and start picking the brains of the scientists there. And there's plenty of opportunities.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks for having me, Ross. This is awesome.
Right. I think that'll do it. We've been talking to Brandon Forbes with the U.S. Geological Survey. As you can probably tell, he is super smart, way deep into the science of this stuff. I learned a ton, thought it was an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I hope you feel the same. So I hope you learned something. I hope that you learned, maybe above all, don't mess with runoff. Don't mess with powerful water. You could have a really bad time. But also how you can get out there and really start digging into the data here, because these are your rivers, right? This is your home. It's your safe place. It's probably the place that you love the most, or at least for me, it's the place that I love the most. And being able to understand it at an even deeper level, I think, is one of the coolest parts of this crazy fly fishing thing we do, where we get to plug into and work with and work around this incredible ecosystem and general hydrologic system that we call rivers. So I hope you had fun. I hope you have a great week. I hope you're out there fishing. If you're listening to this during runoff, please don't be stupid. Be smart. Find somewhere else to go. But no matter what, I hope you're catching fish. I hope you're outside. And I'm looking forward to seeing you back here real soon. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. Unless you got swept away in the flood.